Okay, everybody, thank you so much and good afternoon. Thank you for coming to my presentation about building resilient applications and infrastructure with CI and CD. I am Eric Cobb. My friends call me Cobb. Just by virtue of being here, you all are invited to call me Cobb, invited to be my friends. Good to meet you. I'm the CTO at Zoltrain, where we build software that teaches people how to sell drugs. This presentation targets SaaS companies, software companies, mostly I call it enterprise web application companies, people who are deploying code onto the internet. And I'm going to define some of these terms here shortly, so don't worry. But let's kind of dig in. First, I want to talk about, I got to do this too. Why should you care? Why should you care about CI/CD? Well, fundamentally, what this boils down to, what this entire thing that I'm going to be talking about today boils down to is how we are able to react more quickly to issues that users are having. It's not only issues as in bugs, it's opportunities that we have. It's new features that we can deploy. So if someone wants to do something with our software that they're not able to do, it's how we can move really quickly and address those concerns. Fundamentally, build and deliver more good stuff faster with less people. I think that is so fundamental, it's almost axiomatic. What we're talking about here is we're talking about how we succeed as a business. We are a business that delivers software to people, so doing it faster and better and cheaper means that we are doing good business. So doing a good business. I gotta sync up here. Okay, so quick time for a story. A few weeks ago, our development team, me, is happily writing code, implementing new features, and suddenly start receiving a lot of alerts, a lot of email notifications about a strange number of, a high number of client request errors that are happening in our content authoring API. This is very strange because our content authoring API is something that's only accessed by a web client. By web applications. So it's not users constructing API requests, it is a program that's making these requests. So something's off. Dig into the logs a little bit that we can access from our notifications and see that we are getting validation issues. The requests are malformed. That's really weird because it's coming from our UI. To get more details, we hop over to our session monitoring tool where we can actually watch playback and watch users click around inside our app. What we're able to see then is we're able to see a really specific case where a user uploads the content of a specific type, and not on their first save, but on their second, third, subsequent saves, they are getting a specific error. So it's a single user having a really, really bad time clicking the same button over and over again. So what do? We alert our CS team. CS team reaches out directly to the user. They're told, hey, sit tight, we got a fix incoming. The engineering team has exact steps to reproduce because we have the session playback. We know exactly what's going on between the client and the server. So we're able to fix it really quickly. And then as soon as our build turns green, code's deployed. By the time the customer finishes their cup of coffee, they're able to log on and finish the work that they were trying to do. This happened. Is often a whoa moment for our customers. It's something that people say whoa to. You might say whoa to depending on who you are, what you're up to. How do we manage that? How can you manage that? I won't say it's simple, but what we're really going to be focusing on talking about today, there's a lot of components to it. What we are going to be talking about today is taking the things that you will be doing anyway as a software company and turning them into superpowers. So as a software company, I mentioned the thing that we're doing is we're delivering code. So we're going to be building, we're going to be deploying code. The other things that we're doing is we're generating a fairly large amount of data. The big data sense, people are talking about millions and millions of data points. This is a large amount of data for what we're talking about. What I'm talking about here is logs. Not only logs that developers write and specify, but some of the other services that we leverage sort of generate incidental logs. Web servers generate server request logs. Databases often write logs out when they issue a slow request or a slow query. There's also a whole subsection of user-generated events. You're probably familiar with Google Analytics if you have experience with that. When a user is clicking around inside your app using it, they're actually just generating a ton of data. So how can we capture that? How can we use it to be better at what we do? So first thing I'm going to focus on, is this CI/CD. So it's time to actually define what I'm talking about. here. CI/CD stands for continuous integration / continuous deployment. Continuous integration is the idea that as developers are writing code, the changes that they make are continuously integrated back into a main line. So rather than, in some situations, you'll think about developers kind of branching, going away. You think about the way an operating system is developed. Apple takes, 6 months a year working on an operating system, and they deliver the new operating system all at once. When the concept of continuous integration, which is something that we are specifically able to do very easily in a web development environment, is that every time we make a change, we're pushing those changes back into the main line. The other part of that continuous deployment is that once those changes are made, we're able to push those changes somewhere that a user can access them. So how does this help? Why is this important? Why is this special with what we do? There's a few things. One I've already touched on, but it's definitely worth mentioning again, this idea that we can move quick. We can move very fast. We can deploy new features very fast, whether it's a bug fix or a new idea. A fellow earlier today was talking about changes that he was making based on a customer suggestion, and they were able to get it. It was like time to suggestion to implementation was 23 minutes. That's the sort of thing that you're able to do if you're kind of leaning in really hard to this continuous integration and continuous deployment workflow. The other things it does is it changes the way that you think about code. When the changes you make are going to customers sort of automatically and rapidly, you have to be thinking about things like backwards compatibility. Is this going to break anything? You have to be thinking about, your product team has to be thinking about, how can we make these changes as small as possible so that they're controlled, but they're also meaningful. We talk about slicing and dicing stuff all the time. Sometimes you do have to work on something for a long time before it's ready for prime time. That often leads you to think about feature flags. How can I be working on something that is going into the main line, but isn't something that's, being exposed to people every time they log into the app? Thinking about being able to turn features on and off for users is really powerful. It's powerful for testing, it's powerful for A/B testing, and it's also super powerful in the context of being able to sell things to people, being able to turn features on and off. So there's a lot of benefits there. When I think about CI, I tend to think about it as a pipeline. So this illustration here, we're talking about a pipeline. It has 3 main pillars. Almost always, I think about it in terms of the code being built, the code being tested, and then the code being deployed. So what you see here is the test and build, these 2 things happening. This is GitHub. Talk a little bit about tools in a second here. But this is the code being built and deployed, tested and built simultaneously, because those 2 steps aren't relying on one another. And then after that, deployed. Building, so just to kind of break down these definitions a little bit, building, I think of as verifying that the code is correct, verifying the correctness of the code. So sometimes in the context of like a statically typed programming language, you'll see that's compiling. So that's like Java compiling the code into an executable, or C compiling a code to an executable. In dynamic languages, you still have tools that you can use. For example, JavaScript, really popular one is ESLint. That's a tool that's used to check against, the JavaScript community is very rich, to kind of check against a list of things that we know tend to cause bugs in our code, and we can automatically check. This kind of loops back, to use kind of the buzzword, you kind of think about the virtuous cycle. This kind of loops back into this idea of integration. So this is using GitHub here as a tool for integrating a pull request. So integrating changes that I want to make into our mainline code here. And these checks are running. So what these checks are doing is these checks are, verifying the code is built. They're verifying the code has been tested. That's this part down here, code testing. Wanted to talk about testing just a little bit. I'm going to dive into that here shortly, but I did want to mention, I could give a whole 2-hour conversation about the importance and the use cases for tests. So that is why the test step has its own sort of separate entity when I talk about the CI/CD pipeline, because I do think it's actually super important. When it comes to, you're seeing this stuff and you're thinking, how can I get started? How can we kind of, we're not doing this right now. Right now, we only deploy it once a month or whatever. The first thing that I would say, the first tip that I would give you is just bear in mind that fear is the mind killer. That's Litany of Fear from Dune. What will happen as you are kind of going down this road is that you will make mistakes. It's really important to kind of give yourself and your team some grace. And instead of really focusing on those mistakes, to focus on what you can learn from them. It's also really important to not get superstitious about those mistakes. A good example of this that you see in so many organizations is one time Cobb deployed code on Friday, everything broke and we lost our weekend. So now we don't deploy code on Friday. And then, one time Cobb deployed code the Monday after a holiday, everything broke and now we don't deploy the Monday. You start to get all these random rules about what we do and don't do. I think you'll be much better served instead to focus on sort of the root cause. What went wrong? Why were your processes not able to catch what was about to go wrong? Address that and kind of move forward. Couple more quick tips. Bad builds and tests. This is kind of important. It's going to come up a little bit later too. If you're dealing with builds that sort of fail intermittently or tests that fail intermittently, fix them. Do not live with stuff that's flaky. I would rather delete a flaky test than live with it. It causes noise. It makes it really hard to cut through the noise and identify when something's going wrong. Software it's all based on cause and effect, right? Like there's no magic. So if something's failing intermittently, there's probably a flag, there's probably something going on there. So it's probably something worth thinking about. Okay, so second part, after CI/CD, I want to talk about the other aspect of how the other superpower that we can get from the stuff we're doing anyway, talking about this operational data. The first and probably one of the most important things is to use log aggregation. So I mentioned before that just by building software and using these services, you're going to be just generating a ton of logs. Log aggregation is a tool that takes all of those various logs, can be running in all different places. Modern software development, we tend to run a lot of different services and kind of centers and puts them in one place where you can quickly search them and figure out what the hell's going on. You also could set up alerts. That was kind of the beginning of the story. I started to get those email alerts coming in. You can set up all kinds of alerts. Like I use a tool called Loggly, and it lets me set up alerts like based on counts when something sort of exceeds a standard deviation of what would be considered normal. That's how I know I'm getting an unusually high number of client request errors, stuff like that. It's also really important to hold yourself and your team accountable to actually looking at and reacting to those alerts. So if your team's big, chat operations can be really great. Like instead of just an email notification, dropping those into a Slack channel and making sure that people, put eyes on it, put the green check mark on it to verify that stuff is good. Just some tips on getting started when it comes to log aggregation. Pick a tool and use it. Make a list of all the services and things that you have that are generating logs. Try and sort those according to how useful and important you think they'll be, and start to go down them. Don't boil the ocean. You don't have to get everything centralized in one day. You can start to kind of migrate things over. As you do that, make a standard operating procedure about how you do that. If you're running on AWS, how do you set up the Lambda that sends stuff to Loggly? If you're running just in servers, how do you install the shell script that sends logs over to Loggly? That way, when you kind of going back to what I was saying before, when you do make that mistake, when you do miss something because you didn't set up the log correctly, instead of beating yourself up about it, you can just follow the SOP, get that log sent, and make sure it doesn't happen again. I mentioned noise. This is another thing that I find really important, and a tip that I'll give people. It's really important to tune your alerts. If, for example, you set up an alert for every time that the word error appears in your application, in your logs, you're going to start getting a lot of alerts. It's surprising, actually, how much the word error will appear even when things are behaving relatively normally. What you don't want is you don't want a situation where 70 times a day you get an alert that you just know to ignore. That's more noise that you're going to tend to ignore, and then you're going to tend to miss what's important. So either it's kind of like tests, either delete it, fix it, or figure out a way to address it. Another thing that can happen when there's a lot of noise is you end up with a log shaman. You end up with only one person who understands exactly what alerts and exactly how you need to react. So I think it's really important to kind of focus in and make sure that anyone who could get this alert knows that those alerts need to be addressed. Last piece about this operational data, session playback. I kind of mentioned this earlier. when I was telling the story about how we're actually able to go and observe what's going on when users are using our application, this is an extraordinarily powerful tool. Two services that I'm aware of that offer it, LogRocket came up earlier today, and FullStory. What these tools do, especially in the context of a web application, is they record all the events that a user is, creating as they are using your app, and then they transform those events, recreate the DOM, and they turn it into a video that you can watch. So you can actually watch a user clicking on your app without, anyone sitting there and actually recording your user's screen. You can imagine why that's super powerful. The network requests are recorded. You can see people getting frustrated. You can see what requests are being generated. You can track down really weird bugs. It's super easy to set up. If you are familiar with Google Analytics, it's about like that, like dropping a few lines of code in. Just note, I'm not a lawyer. That would be the only consideration. There is some privacy stuff. So you got to make sure you have good privacy protections in place and permissions as well. Some quick tips on getting started with session playback. A lot of these tools do support building funnels. Those can be very powerful, so I recommend doing it. Funnel is just a marketing funnel or classic product management funnel. For example, you can see and watch when people bounce out of the sign-up flow and why. Well, maybe not why, you can guess as to why, but you can see when they bounce out and make conclusions about it. The other thing is most of these tools support kind of saved searches, filters, segments. I recommend adding those and mirroring the alerts that you'll be getting from your log aggregations. So for example, if you're getting an alert every time a user encounters a specific web server error, like a 500 error, it's really handy to be able to go over to your session tool and just say, give me every 500 error that a user encountered, and you can just kind of really easily track it down. That's very helpful, especially if something is sort of a high stress moment. You're trying to troubleshoot what's going on so that you don't have to stress about, well, how do I find this particular user session and stuff like that. Yeah, and I think that's all I got. So any questions? Shoot.
Okay, so how do you, and what is your perspective on how do you avoid turning, and should you avoid turning a CI/CD framework into just like you're constantly hot fixing?
Constantly hot fixing. So you're asking how did you avoid?
Yeah. So in a world in which like your CI/CD, right, and the idea is just like your daily deployments or even like constant deployments. I guess that's the whole point of the continuous, right?
Mm-hmm.
How do you avoid like a creep of just a ton of tasks associated with like fixing little things that are coming up?
Got it.
That are ultimately probably adding to tech debt, whereas just taking a second, realizing that like all these tasks are not, and just like dealing with like whatever the tech debt thing, like where do you find the balance in that?
That's a good question. So the question to repeat for the room, if I understand it, is given this power, this ability that we have to do these rapid fixes, how instead of doing product development work, how do we make sure that we maintain focus, or should we even be sure to maintain focus on building specific product features or just kind of pushing hot fixes? I think the biggest piece of advice I could give is don't write bugs. That helps a lot. To be serious though, I think it's important to think about your team's position sort of in a broader team, right? And I think really what you're talking about is almost a product management problem. So when you're identifying these issues, it's not necessarily my team's or my responsibility to immediately respond to them unless they are, breaking issues. And I think, that's sort of like one of those definitions, it when you see it, like if something's critical, if something's breaking the world, I know I have to jump on it and Danny doesn't have to tell me. But broadly speaking, when we identify these issues, we do kind of put them into a funnel, and that's a whole process thing. I had a whole nother section here about, just in case no one asks any questions, about other stuff that matters. And I think one of the things that does matter is sort of the processes that kind of are built around your product management team and how you work together. So, you can imagine a lot of different ways, given all this data, that information goes into a queue of bugs that's then triaged and prioritized accordingly by your product management team. Shoot.
If you were not doing any of this, what is the one first step? Like what's the most impactful one thing out of the list to start chipping away at getting there?
Kubernetes. I think the biggest and most important thing is the CI, and specifically having and running an automated test suite that is that your developers can run locally, quickly, that they can run as they're writing code, and it also is running every single time a developer attempts to make a change. If you don't have tests at all, and you're looking at hundreds of thousands of lines of code or tens of thousands of lines of code, and how do you start? What I recommend is establishing a rule that, you don't have to wake up tomorrow and say, we're going to have 90% code coverage, but establishing a rule that our code coverage is only going to go up from now. So today it's 0, and every change we make, it's going to start to creep up. So that's kind of your rule on how you can start to grow it. That has impacts on, how well I sleep at night, because I know my code is good. It has impacts on how we actually write code, because as you are trying to write automated unit tests, you do sort of discover that your code tends to change, so it's more testable, which has the side effect of making it a little bit better too. So yeah, I would say getting that specific step of the CI flow running. Yep. Anything else?
Can you talk about because CI/CD itself is a funnel, right? Like you have like CI is the phase 1, and then CD is like we're all happy, like deploy.
Sure.
But can you talk about like sort of the discrepancy in cadence between CI and CD? Like I imagine you're probably batching features that have been CI'd into a main branch or whatever, and then probably you have to approve, okay, this is in fact going to production. How do you manage those?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So how do we manage, do we batch, do we have sort of a process by which we have a lot of different changes for getting stage for production? I don't. And I would say the ideal sort of the state to be in is to, if you're going to be in a real continuously integrated environment, continuously deployed environment, I would sort of encourage you to not think about it that way, but to go and really think about to get really granular. If I'm working on a new feature, I will make a branch in that feature and work on it, for a day or two. And when I'm ready, I'll submit a pull request. When that pull request is approved, goes back into the main line, the CI process kicks off, which culminates in an automated deploy. So anytime a change is made, I want it to culminate in an automated deploy. So that does affect, what I was saying about thinking about the way that you have to think about your code and the way you have to design, the way you have to architect things, because, then you're in a situation where if a bunch of people are working and making changes, first in's gonna be deployed into production. So you really have to be thinking about, if I change this database schema, is this gonna mess someone else before some other piece of code is executed? Those sorts of things become important, right? So it does affect the way you think. But I found that the rapidity with which you can deploy, and the way that it does alter the way you think, those benefits are so huge, that it really outweighs, the drawbacks of just taking on that additional cognitive load.
Yeah. One more question. Do you think about CI/CD across various different environments? For example, you might have a staging environment where you're maybe you have some Selenium testing against that staging, And maybe if and when things get approved from some perspective, those changes get promoted to production. Like, do you have,
Sure.
that problem is huge.
No, it's a huge problem. And actually, I can't say that I have found a perfect solution to that. I've toyed around with a couple things. One thing that I will say is I have found that it is really good when, just like when I mentioned that it's important for a developer to be able to execute all their tests locally. I think it's really important for, any specific thing I'm working on for that I can sort of generate an environment for that thing. So, yeah. But yeah, I think it's important to be able to generate an environment for a thing. And then, sometimes a user gesture is okay, to say, like, I want to promote this to, I want to test this somewhere. I want to be able to say, hey, test this on staging or whatever. So I've used that as well.